Good evening, Vietnam. Welcome to the public program of Summerschoolasschool 2018. Tonight, I'm very happy that we have with us two course teachers presenting. So we will have an opportunity to have some insight, you know, also what they were doing with participants within their courses. I'm very pleased to announce the presentation, Representation and Crisis of Visibility from Memorial to Film by Linda Gusia. I'll just read briefly some selection from her bio, and you have all the materials in the space, and you can have them with you. So Linda Gusia teaches at the University of Prishtina, Department of Sociology. She received her MA from New York University in 2003 and her PhD from the University of Prishtina in 2016. She's currently a member of the steering committee of the Program for Gender Studies and Research at the University of Prishtina. In 2014, she was a fellow at the Gender Research Institute at Dartmouth College. Her research interests include gender, sexuality, nationalism, and collective memory in the context of conflict, war, and public spaces. As part of her PhD thesis, she interrogated ambiguities of nationalism and gender through the lens of the women's movement in Kosovo and sexual violence as a strategy of war, looking closely at visual and textual representations of the politics of gender. The recent publications include I'll just read the last line.
It is raining outside and the president, that's what some
No, it's fantastic.
and talk about them and dismantle them.
Yeah. I think it's a great weather, actually.
Yeah, for watching a movie, but not reading my Bible.
Yeah. So the full schedule of public lectures and presentations can be found online and our pages on social media networks. The floor is yours. Thank you for being with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. So it's been almost more than a week of discussion at Summerschoolasschool, and we really tried to talk a lot about representation and gender, and we really tried to contextualize it. And in our class today, we've seen a film, Theming, and talked about it. So maybe I'll have a shorter analysis because we had a long discussion in the class and focus more on 3D thought and art. Just a disclaimer, and also as a feminist, we are taught to reflect a lot from our standpoint position and talk about how we are entering the discussion and how we are doing our research, and also I make a lot of disclaimers. I want to say that I'm a sociologist, not a film critic, and my relationship with film was mostly as a very curious, enthusiastic moviegoer and movie viewer, and I try to look at a lot of movies. I integrated these two particular films, Ktimi and Idridar and Ivarje, in my research because I really wanted to capture. I thought that after I watched these two films in particular, I thought that these two films really mirror a lot on the discussion that was going on the past 3 or 4 years in Kosovo about wartime sexual violence. Both of them in different ways. And both of them mirror this almost obsession with breaking the silence and talking about wartime sexual violence. So before I go into a discussion about both of these movies, maybe just to look at the trailers shortly and have an idea of what we're talking about. I actually wanted to show the film Ktimi today, The Return, here, because it's only 20 minutes. But there's some dispute between the producer and the director, so so we'll just watch the trailer. So this is a trailer for a short film Bine.
Ma ci faccio una sera?
E come per te, già poca cosa sei.
Che dormi prima famiglia? Per dice che canto prima.
Non canto prima.
Luca, che faccio capo saltia. Ty kad on się pomysłają?
Nie, to wracają.
Domnul Martu. Domnul Martu. Ei. Sentite.
Ma chi si dietro?
Ce l'ha passato.
Che ho? Te, gazzetta.
Te,
Lu che canti te.
ce l'ha passato.
Ci ti manca tu. Ciao.
Ci rimasto a poter vedi se prato să canta boba chimo.
Tu stai a corpora.
Tu stai, tim che padre e șef che tu mi librit. Eu sem șef de vizita mare mi aspeci e șef de ștu plătătone de să nu can. Eu! Tu poți să facă nici știu n-am. Ti vezi că n-am ce-și mă dau pur para ca tu nu.
Quando tretei de música uma policia, então como que se foi no caso, не сейчас, сколько кичука.
Diário a escolher, o rito vou pôr, queria dizer ter uma bota, mas já que eu digo a mancada.
Bom, jest radialnie ryjne.
A nie?
Ty mamy kiedy dietę.
Życie cię żal.
Ciao.
Скомплите trzeba.
Awesome.
So these were just two films. The film Theme, Return, was filmed in 2012 and won the Sundance Film Festival for the best short film. And the other film, Tuditore Nivorje, also showed in a lot of festivals, and it was filmed around it was released in 2014. So 2012 and 2014, we had these years of finally coming to terms with wartime sexual violence in Kosovo. So the discussion generally in the society was about breaking the silence, talking for the first time about wartime sexual violence. In other films before, you had a lot of scenes of sexual violence, but no particular discussion about sexual violence. And these two films, Tuditore Nivorje and Theme, are very focused on this breaking the silence and discussion about wartime sexual violence. So in reading them today is a way of talking in general, so the context is also about how the society was really concerned about this breaking of silence. These two films were also very successful artistically, locally and internationally. We had a lot of screenings of both of these films. Tuditore Nivorje also had a lot of Tifete Yoga, former president, also screened it and took upon her to have a lot of screening and discussions around the world around Tuditore Nivorje. Both films have very similar plots. In both films you have men that were missing and were returning home to find out that their wives were also raped. So the story, the narration is very similar in both films. I have to say that Theme was done before, and then in 2014. But in both stories, it's this men who return to find that the women were raped. So Triditar in Libya is a film by a prominent Kosovo film director, Linda Gusia, who belongs to a generation of film directors from a socialist era. Although Kosovo film into the cinematography was really not very famous in Yugoslavia. It has 2 or 3 films that have more viewing, but it was not a big cinematographic production in Kosovo. But nevertheless, Stacion was very famous, and Linda Gusia in this film Theme was just starting her career as a filmmaker. So Theme, I'll start with Theme because it's a shorter one. So the film is dedicated, at the end we have dedication to missing persons and victims of war. She doesn't particularly want to name wartime sexual violence. And it's an ambitious attempt of the director to tell 2 difficult stories. The story of a missing person and the story of wartime sexual violence is sort of simultaneous. Also, the stories kind of unravel. So you have the story of a man who was in a Serbian prison and who is returning, and the story of his wife who was here and left behind. The story is based in urban context, and I think this is different. A lot of the films that are produced in Kosovo are usually based in a rural context and try to depict a rural life. I think that this also has to do with this sense of going back to this narrative of patriarchal traditional societies and going back to the village. It's kind of sets the scene of this talking about this patriarchy in a certain sense. This film, however, has been talks middle class family. The women worked for OSCE during the war, so she's this independent woman from Prishtina who was raped. I have to also emphasize that women in urban Kosovo really were the most silent victims of wartime sexual violence. So we have organizations who have dealt with wartime sexual violence, and it is mostly women from the villages that are talking about wartime sexual violence, and women from urban areas who were raped during the war. There's a complete silence, and really, if you look at the stories of the women that are talking about their experience, the women from urban places are very silent, almost non-existent. So it's very interesting that this film talks about wartime sexual violence in urban Prishtina. So the film Theme, the narrative develops in this sort of warm, intimate atmosphere, and I think that Dirka's film in general tried to develop this intimacy in the film. There is this, the story, the breaking of the story happens in bed, and they are being really connected and laughing and talking, so the husband, for example, starts talking about the story of prison experience, and the story oscillates between glorification and jokes and laughing, and this is all, this laughing and bonding is broken by her telling the story. So her story is not light. There's a switch to the mood. There's no giggling and laughs. It's a serious story. And it's a story that doesn't allow for glorification, like in the case of her husband, that he was talking about how he suffered in the Serbian prisons. But her story is saying, I'm ashamed, and the story, the way she tells the story is with this guilt, and she tells she talks about how she got pregnant from this rape, and how she didn't want this child, and this child exists. The name of the child is Jeta, which is an Albanian life. And for her, it's this dealing with it, breaking the story, and the Jeta was there. The fact that the child was born out of the rape is the reality that happened, a reality that the director invites us to face with. Similarly to war suffering, this is the story ends with this Jeta is here. And we see pictures of this little girl walking around, so it's like we have to face her, we have to face the suffering of the story. The film ends, however, in ambiguity. So the silence is broken, and the silence is also received with another silence by her husband. So her husband just walks out of the room after receiving the news and starts walking around the city. And the film kind of ends without, really not knowing what's happening, and focuses at how he received the news, how he is feeling right now. So, and the woman is left in her bed crying, so it's in private, but he goes in the streets and goes to the wall of the missing person and look at the missing person. When I interviewed Greta, she said that for her it was impossible to find an ending for this film. She left the film ambiguous. Because for her, it's she couldn't say would her husband accept her and how the life would be, or not accept her. But she said it depends on how you see it. So it's an open-ended film, and if you see it like that, maybe the husband comes back home. But if, he can as well just walk out of her suffering and what happened. So the film, today we screened the film in our class, and a lot of people cried. I think it's a very emotional film, and it tells a very personal, the way she tells the story, I think, creates a lot of empathy. So you see this couple talking and giggling, and then she talks about it. And then she brings in the society and that fact that, oh, what do we do now? And at the end, she brings in that the silence of society in Kosovo. But she breaks the story, unlike this other film, Traditore anymore. You see slapping, and you see it's a different kind of breaking the story in theming.
Are we allowed to make questions?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Don't you think there's something, this type of representation, rules, and urban, or
Yeah,
so I was just
yeah.
thinking now, because you made the differentiation, I didn't know actually, I never thought about now when you were talking, happens in rural areas, and the second, which has a lot
Most of the
violence.
films in Kosovo happen in rural
Yeah. And then in urban setting, it's more like less of violence in terms of physical, or no physical violence. So isn't this a little bit of, I mean, the fact that there are no women
I think
reported violence from urban area shows a lot of violence in urban area in itself. But then this type of representation of rural, urban, violence, non-violence, isn't it a bit too of a plastic? I mean, what is your opinion on this?
I mean, for me, researching wartime sexual violence, women who were raped in the cities didn't talk about it or didn't go to organizations that helped them deal with the trauma. I think because also of economical reasons, because they were better off than women in the villages. Because one of the things that was very clear to me during my research, that women who were actually speaking about wartime sexual violence were very poor, and really women who had really suffered so much and had nothing to lose. And for them, for example, the campaigning for recognition within the system of law that gives them a little social aid, because I don't call it reparation is something else, but give them that social aid was very important, was a sort of a lifeline, and speaking up was also campaigning for recognition. And they needed that sort of recognition, economical recognition as well. And women in urban setting not necessarily needed that recognition, and I think that the stigma is the same in rural and urban. It's just, I think that it was interesting that she picked urban, and I think that it's only her style. I think that Bjerta Zeciri is Bjerta Zeciri, and I have to mention here Linda Gusia and Antoneta Castroti, that I think is a new generation of female filmmakers that I think are making a big shift in our film industry, because all three of them are actually very set on being very true to the story.
But they are doing the shift, not the men.
Yeah, they are doing the shift. This is what I'm saying.
The classic story.
Yeah. All three of them, for example, Bjerta and I'm not analyzing here Alga's House, which is in Vita Zeciri new film, which I think is a wonderful film, because it's not out yet. I had a chance to see it. But all the film of Bjerta insists on intimacy, insists on humanizing it. She still focuses on the man, which for me is a critique, that why are you, because the film at the end is just kind of more about how he's taking it. And I think it's symptomatic in general on the campaigns about wartime sexual violence. This is what I find so interesting in reading both of these films, is that even the campaigns and even the discussion about wartime sexual violence in our society were more about how men are going to take it. Because now we're telling this story, and maybe I'm jumping at the film Traditore di Nipore, it's like, where were you? Was one of the accusations. So it was almost, where were you to protect me? So almost this breaking the silence also invited the question of where were the men, right? And Bjerta doesn't do that. Bjerta talks about it in a more intimate way. I think because, not because she's constructing a certain kind of story, but because her position is to be very truthful, and I've interviewed Bjerta many times about her films, and for her it's the importance of really she considers herself an artist that just bears witness. So she just wants to tell it as it is. And for her, this is why she didn't focus so much at how the woman was feeling. And she was focusing more how the man is taking it, because it, for her, mirrored how the society is talking about the issue of wartime sexual violence. It's this obsession with how the men are going to take it. And I think that we see this especially in Isa Chosia's film Traditore di Nipore. I mean, the film starts with this beautiful idyllic pictures of the village. Isa Chosia is famous for his pictures, the way he takes his big shots. His films look very pretty. and this one does too. In his film, the story is broken by this teacher, the village teacher. Her husband was missing and she lives alone with her son again. And so she, as a village teacher, when a journalist comes to the village to talk about wartime sexual violence, she feels that it's a part of emancipating and talking about what happened in the village. It's a role of a teacher to also tell the story and break the story. And then this film sets in the village wakes up next morning, so this is a very sleepy village and very quiet village, and wakes up in the morning to find out from the newspapers that the women were raped. And this starts like almost hysteria in the village of who were these women, who was raped. And this starts almost this witch hunt and discussion among men, and it's almost focused all the time on men. Men are talking on Dallas and public sphere about who was there. Was my wife there? Was my sister there? Was my mother there? So this is, and you have men going back home to their wives and asking them, were you raped? In Three Without Any Body, in English is Three Windows and a Hanging, there is also a hanging, a murder, and so a suicide, yes. So a woman, when she was confronted by her husband, was she one of the rape person that the teacher talks about? She doesn't talk, but she hangs herself. So hanging in sort of a national Albanian mythology, hanging for the suicide was part of a sort of a solution. So a lot of the women in our mythology would kill themselves rather than being raped. You have a lot of stories of in our mythology of women committing suicide not to be captured by Turks and not to be. So the suicide as an escape is also finding a solution of, oh, well, we don't know what to do with you. And, so when I confronted the Isa Chosia about this, I said, why do you have to kill her and kill her without explanation? Because she's just confronted, and the act of confronting her leads her to suicide. And he said, well, a lot of women historically in Albania who were raped committed suicide. And then I tried to talk to survivors, and I tried.
What did the show say?
Well, this is what happens in our context, in our society. So he was just reflecting on that and representing that. But when I went back to the field, especially talking to women who were directly working with survivors, they said there were a lot of cases in Kosovo, indeed, of suicide, especially younger women, and even the girls who were, it's been like 10 or 15 years that the rape happened, but then when the family finds out, they commit suicide. So they were telling me about the story. So apparently the suicide also is something that happens. But after the suicide, there is this isolation of this school teacher that breaks the silence. She is fired from her position as a school teacher. Nobody wants to talk to her, so she's left alone. And other women that had survived and were raped during the war also are very mad at her for breaking the silence. And during my research, I also saw this concept of besa. Besa is a word of honor, and I had a lot of survivors telling me, well, I'm only talking for myself because I gave Besa to other women, that I'm not going to talk about who else was there with me, because usually the rapes during the war happened more massively and a group of women were together. But there was this concept of if I'm talking, I'm only talking for myself. And there was this tension of breaking the silence and breaking this also pact of silence. Because there was this pact of silence that we don't talk about this. This is easier if we don't talk about it, or talk about this only among ourselves. So this is something that is also depicted in the film. But the film, you know, the sort of the beginning, the emancipatory call of the teacher breaking the silence, talking to journalists about wartime sexual violence, is really not even by the middle of the film suffocated. It just doesn't, you know, the idea of breaking it and breaking the silence and finally coming free and telling this story doesn't really happen. The consequences of breaking the silence, and Chosia says that this was really what he wanted to do, is show what are the consequences of breaking the silence. So the silence, when it's broken, it's the consequences to that, especially in this patriarchal traditional setting. I think that Chosia really was focused on sort of presenting the brutality of patriarchal reality. So he tries to unravel this traditional reaction, and you see also a lot of violence and domestic violence in the film. And so I think that he's really keen on talking about how difficult it is. I mean, when I interviewed him, he said, well, I just wanted to show why these women are not talking, why there is silence in Kosovo about wartime sexual violence.
Should we take some questions?
Yeah, I'm just, it's easier, I'm just describing.
There's a lot to say.
Yeah, it's easier to do it like this.
Thank you very much for that. You spoke earlier about the symbolism behind the hanging. You could maybe speak a little bit about the
symbolism behind what?
Behind the hanging of three windows and the hanging, and how it has this mythological context. Could you maybe speak a little bit about the symbolism behind three windows, if there is any?
Well, he's trying to look at the three particular cases. So it's like three windows in the house. I mean, I think that it's the way that the director wanted to show is this, it's an intimate, private thing, and we see it in both films, that they view sexual violence as an intimate, private thing. So it's almost like watching from the window, watching inside, watching into the house of somebody. So I think that's very, also, it speaks a lot on the way that they understand wartime sexual violence. And what I found very symptomatic and very ingrained in both of the films is this, the concept of shame and honor and stigma. And I think that it's done in 2012 and 2014. So the discourse, the speaking about wartime sexual violence, even from the position of these campaigns that were happening back then, were from that perspective of stigma and honor. And it's still, for example, we have campaigns that want to deal with stigma. And I think that the focus should not be really on stigma, it should be more on social justice. And the stigma would be, challenged when we speak about a possibility of any kind of justice for the rape survivors.
Just to add something, so two films are different. One is a short film,
Yes.
one is a feature film. So the theme, so this was produced by an independent film festival, which was producing films. It was stopped by a former minister of culture by not doing money, but it's not my story. But it won Sundance Film Festival. So this is the first Kosovo produced film without any international cooperation. Let's say these productions, which won a major film festival. And it's short, and of course you can understand why it doesn't have all these longer stories and explanations. The second film was nominated for like a Kosovo nomination for Oscars. There's 3 windows and a hanging.
Kosovo sent it.
Kosovo nominated. It was the first time that the country, because there's this international Oscars for international best feature films, and Kosovo for the first time could delegate a movie, let's say, and this was the first film that was nominated through this selection. He's a classical director from the Yugoslav film school. Uses a lot of, let's say, artistic gestures and
more dramatic
tools also. But just to explain, there are 2 different types of films that we are talking about, and 2 different, completely different film directors.
It's a topic that brings them together.
Yes, but I'm also not sure that the topic brings them together, because the first one is because they address. Okay, let's open up for questions.
Okay. They address it differently, but it's also maybe the question that we would have a discussion about is who are they made for? You know, who are these films made for? Are they made for local production, or are they both made to speak to a more international audience? So are they made to tell the story to internationals about what happened in Kosovo, or are they made to evoke empathy in Kosovo? So.
Anyone before I give it to
Maybe this is too quick to answer, too early, but it would be interesting to elaborate what it could mean actually locally. And now I'm thinking, as a German, in Germany they call it Geschichtsbewältigung, to deal with your history. And I mean, you can learn from the Germans with that. I would like to ask, what does this mean locally? What are the consequences of this in the long run? What can it change?
It's an expression that we learn from internationals, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think that the local and well, I think that the fact that we really didn't have a discourse or critique on films here was also partly because nobody thought that the films produced here were worthy of critique. And I think that the films that are produced here, especially in the past 4 or 5 years, are really good and are getting better and better. And I think that for this generation that is now producing films, the war was formative for them. The experiences of the war were formative. They all had stories of war or were affected personally by war, and for them, telling the story through film means something else. So for them, the audience, for example, Antonieta Castrotti, Gerta Zecili, and Bendita Zecili, I'm picking the 3 because they are female directors, it's also they're telling the story because for them it's also a closure, it's a therapy. They are also dealing with their own war traumas, and I know them personally, and for them is making a film about a story of the war for them becomes a sort of therapy, self-exposure therapy, how you call it in anthropology. Yeah. So I think that this is why the films are getting better, because the audience is not imagined. And in a lot of the films before, the audience was imagined. Like, how do we represent national culture? And we talked in class today about this burden that our artists have, the burden of representing the stories, telling the stories, and breaking the story to the rest of the world. I think that it's a very big burden for artists who produce in Kosovo to tell the story to international audience. And I think that what makes the films that are produced now recently better, it's not really as much obsessed with the audience and who is going to see the film, but it's more, it's mostly look at how the story is told. And they're all very, the films that are produced now, they are more more truthful to what they think the context is. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is, if this is a closure for the directors and for the viewers and also for the crew involved in making the film, are we closing actually this chapter through the male gaze?
Yeah, the male gaze, yeah.
Is this just sort of a time frame when it's a span of good women directors who conclude with the male gaze? Is this the therapy actually?
And I hear you about the male gaze. I mean, and especially you see this in Three Windows and hanging. The women's bodies and the stories are text in which the society speaks from, and they're really not subjects. All the women that show up in the film, I think, are very flat, and you don't really see.
You have to teach it.
You have to.
No, yeah. I think your analysis is quite problematic.
Yeah.
To tell the truth. First of all, you say that because the Chiri tells the truth. This means that the other director is lying?
No. She's more, her position is mostly, she, for example, she wants to keep, like, I talked to her about why some of the dialogues that she has in the film, I think, are very simple and banal sometimes, and I was like, I really didn't like that, and she said, well, I really think this is how people talk, and I really draw from my own experience. So I think in that sense of sort of being truthful to their own experience, I think that's where that, I'm not saying that somebody's telling the truth and the other is not. I'm just saying that there is also a position, a conscious position by these directors to be very truthful to what they think is their experience. And I think there is a difference there. Because when you go to, if you look at Tridritar and Igor, there's a lot of staging, for example. At the end of the film, you have this big tree and the men coming together and this sofra and the way they, how much experience you have of village life, but it's really staged. If you
also, just to add something about Kosovo cinematography, maybe this is important. So there was a Kosovo cinematographic center, which in Isa Chosi was part of a group of directors which made huge feature films, actually. So it was not a minor cinematography.
Compared to Yugoslavia, it was.
So some directors, like Stacion and many others, so he won awards in Yugoslavia. This was the first feature film that he could do, just to give some context, the first feature film that he could do since 80s. So let's say 1989, when Kosovo somehow lost its autonomy, the cinematographic center ceased to exist, basically. So no films were produced. So this film was a huge investment on the behalf also of the state to produce a first feature film that somehow showed a part of reality. So it was an ambitious endeavor. It was not a simple film. So many people, part of the crew, were also people who used to work at the Kosovo Cinematography Center. For instance, the person dealing with photography, like they tried to assemble more or less a team which used to function before. And I would not underestimate them in a way, and I would not group them in a very simplistic way, like male and female directors. And I'm very doubtful also about the other directors or the perception how it is. But analyzing the film, it's a very specific film. So yes, it creates. I mean, it's bad that we don't see the film when we are talking about it, and you should watch the film. But it creates these parabolas, you know, it uses these tools which he wants to impress you with scenery, with.
And he does. It's a beautiful scenery. I think that everybody would agree on that.
He used to do this also in the 80s, and it is a very challenging film. But for instance, carefully observing how the person who breaks to use your language, the narrative, she's a woman, right? So she's a school teacher, and this is classical again because he's a classical director. He's not, but it's a woman. You cannot. You have to recognize that he places women in a certain role. He shows a part of reality, and also talking about the truth. I will come back later. But so. It is not one-dimensional, so it is quite interesting to observe. Another thing about the truth, I mean, this is because the truth in relation to war is very complicated.
It is.
Situation, I think.
And the truth was the wrong word. I should have chosen the experience.
There's an estimate that 20,000 women were raped during the war. It's an estimate, let's say. But if you research a bit more, the figure came out after one single research, basically.
I mean, you cannot, I think that putting number to wartime sexual violence is the very wrong.
You know, so it's, they created a commission, they now want people to sign up to let's say, to be recognized as a person who were raped, but also people who are involved in these processes really don't know what they're doing. This is my personal opinion, and very few people are coming forward in this process.
No, they have 5 years.
5 years to come out, but
566 women only from April until now have.
I'm not sure that figure.
No, I am very sure that's an official figure. You can check it.
Okay.
No, it's 576 women for only in a very short period from April till now. Yes, and 100 have just and also naming, putting the number. It's rape is not something that you can quantify in numbers. Wartime rape or rape outside of the war. The rape is very stigmatized, and what happens usually is the victim is re-victimized, and a lot of the rape victims in general don't speak because of this gaze, because of this, the way the society violates them again. So to find an exact number of how many women were raped during the war is impossible, and I think we should give up on putting a number.
But you have a memorial in the center of the city.
Yes, I know, which is very, it's estimated, yeah. Sorry.
I realize I get quite nervous with the discussion for two reasons. Like, first of all, like the question, maybe I start by Germany. I don't hope anybody learns anything from Germany, because the so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung just keeps to be a thing to be instrumentalized. Like now we're sort of the world champions of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and this is instrumentalized for other political discourses, and this is nationalist discourses. So I wonder, the interesting question is here, and I come to the second point, not to talk about numbers, and I don't care like if 20,000 or 30,000 or whatever, like, and I wouldn't want to have a medal coming to this Herina memorial we talked about, just because you mentioned it, and we talked about in this report also. So the question for me is one of individual biographies and more and perspectives more than a question of numbers. So, I'm coming to my main point, but I think it's more interesting actually to talk about the discourse that follows this kind of films, and because these films are part of a way that the country deals with the fact that many women have been raped during the war, and if we don't want it to be part of a nationalist discourse, like it's partly in Germany, then we would have to talk about this individual perspective and what it means, and then we could go to the next level, seeing how this film deals with this kind of perspective. And I think you mentioned some really important point for this. So I would like to talk about this, like what's the political discourse around this, the fact that many women have faced sexual violence and rape through the war.
Well, as I said, the context of making of this film. Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Maybe we can hear the answer. Maybe we can hear the answer.
Yes.
Maybe we can hear the answer.
Okay, well, the discourse was after the war. There was really a silence on wartime sexual violence. I should also add that in general, in Kosovo, dealing with the war and what happened in the war was really not part of a discourse, or there was really no serious effort on dealing with the past in Kosovo. What happened during the war was really not dealt with publicly. The project of Kosovo was building a new state of Kosovo. So having a closure and dealing with the past was really not something that was encouraged, especially by international community in Kosovo. Even when the discussion about wartime sexual violence started, and I have interviewed President Yahyoga and Dora Chikako, like two women politicians that were really trying to also speak on behalf of recognition of wartime sexual violence, they have told me in official interview that they had a lot of pressure, especially of course, from our politician, Dora Chikako was then Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she had pressure from her own boss, who is now President of Kosovo, not to open the subject, and also by international community, because they thought that opening up any discussion on war, and even wartime sexual violence, would just open a can of worms and would make things more complicated, and the focus should be now on the future. So I think that the approach that the politicians, local and international in Kosovo, took toward dealing with the past was, let's look forward and not deal with the past. And if you walk around Kosovo and you speak with people in Kosovo, the war is very much present. But then we have, if you look at demography, as a sociologist I must, it's 70% of Kosovars are under 35. 50% are under 25. So 50% of Kosovars have no personal recollection of war. So the way these stories are told becomes important now, almost 15, 20 years after the war, because you have the generation, like this year, University of Prishtina accepted the first generation who was born after the war. So we have a very new generation and really no discussion on what happened in the war. And the films, cinematography takes a lot of money. To produce a film takes a lot of money. Right? You need more money than in other art production to produce a decent film, even if it's a short film. So yes, in the 90s we had no production. After the war, we had really no serious production. Now you have more attention in the cinematography in Kosovo because there's more money, because there is also more attention. The Sundance Film Festival, you have more films in Kosovo being successful. And I didn't mean I understand the fact that Isa Çoçer comes from a particular school of representation, and I really like the way I like his photography a lot. But I think that his story really relies on his ideas of what tradition and patriarchy is and the honor is. And I think that for his generation, it was this burden of artists that I'm talking about to tell the story was even bigger in his generation. And I am not a filmmaker. I only looked at these films because I was curious, and I thought that I was researching wartime sexual violence, and I thought that these two films really talk a lot about the way that we talk about wartime sexual violence. The focus was on men and how men are taking this breaking of silence.
Mrs. Kosovo?
Going back to the focus being on men, from what you were saying, it seems to be not the focus as men as perpetrators of the violence, though, but the men of being related to or friends of females who were victims of the violence.
Yes.
And I'm really interested then in the conversation as men as perpetrators of this kind of this violence, and how that works in the film.
Yeah, well, it's really not the part of the film. I mean, in all these films that portray, so you had previous films this done after the war, you had more like scene of the rape itself, and then you had this also stereotypical image of how that the Serb soldier looked like. But in these two films that I looked closely, there is a telling a story. There is a narration of what happened, but there is really no discussion about who did, how they looked or the man. But so the focus, why I'm critical on this sort of how men are taking it, because this is still the patriarchal, and this sort of talking about wartime sexual violence is still done within these paradigms of honor and shame. And so you had the awareness-raising campaign saying they are heroes, heroinat, and it's making them heroinat because the discourse of talking about past is only heroinat. So you're either dead and silence, or you are hero. So usually they go together. Dead people are heroes and martyrs, and that's the only discourse that was allowed. So everybody's a hero. So you go to a village and you have civilians being killed, but they are commemorated as martyrs. And I think that it's a way of claiming agency. It's a way of saying they didn't die in vain, and it's their contribution to the nation. And they both. The discussion, the public discussion, for example, I just mentioned the memorial heroinat, and we looked at the memorial a lot. Memorial heroinat is this memorial built in 2015, just across the street from Newborn, and it's a memorial that commemorates women who survived wartime sexual violence. Now there's a lot of discussion that now it's about all the women, but the memorial has this 20,000 pins, alleged number of women who were raped. So, but the name heroinat is very, within this narrow framework. This is the narrow framework of the contribution for the nation, the sacrifice of the nation. This is how you measure. So, what have you done for the nation? How have you sacrificed for the nation? And I think that the films too should also help us transform and maybe challenge this narrow framework of thinking about past, and these biographies and showing particular stories and complexities of that stories, I think is one way forward to also humanize these stories and remove them from this idea of who contributed and how they contributed and where were you when there was I during the war. It will just change the discourse, and I like these new films that are being produced now because they attempt to do this. They attempt to just tell a story, tell a biography, not really be so much concerned about the society. And I think this is a shift. I read it like that. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not. I'm here as a sociologist, so I'm just talking about the way I see the representation that I see it. So I'm not a film critic. I made that disclaimer.
We have to get through the next presentation. Thank you so much for the and we have a lot to talk about this. Thank you very much.